Thank you for joining us. I'm Steve Holmer, Senior Policy Advisor with American Bird Conservancy, to discuss our comments on the Northern Spotted Owl Critical Habitat Rule and Economic Analysis. American Bird Conservancy is concerned and disappointed by the draft Northern Spotted Owl Rule designation for promoting both the logging of owl habitat and the elimination of owl reserves. Provisions in the draft encourage unproven thinning and forestry techniques that, combined with the permissive view of adverse modification, which allows degradation of owl habitat, along with suggestions that elimination of reserves is compatible with owl recovery, have the potential to allow for logging of areas now protected by the Northwest Forest Plan, including mature forests that the plan had intended to become old growth. These provisions, which were repeated numerous times in the draft and reaffirmed in the economic analysis and environmental assessment, appear to intend an increase in timber harvest in the region. Unchanged, this language has the potential to allow excessive logging to the detriment of the northern spotted owl population and may foreclose owl recovery by not providing adequate late successional forest necessary to ensure high-quality owl habitat in the future. Additional habitat protection is needed to stabilize and eventually recover the northern spotted owl's population. And ABC appreciates the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for identifying nearly 14 million acres of potential critical habitat necessary to recover the species. With some modest additions and other changes we propose, the final rule can provide a path towards eventual recovery and delisting. ABC's comments point out that downgrading to endangered status is warranted for the northern spotted owl. The species, which is an indicator of the health of the old-growth ecosystem, continues to decline. It's estimated there are fewer than 4,000 pairs left, and the risk of extinction is high unless the trend is changed. The legacies of past active management and agency misconduct have not been adequately considered in regard to new proposals for active management. Given the continuing pressure to weaken protections for these forests to meet economic needs and to pay for local government services, it's essential that firm and effective standards, such as the system of late successional reserves provided by the Northwest Forest Plan, remain in place. The environmental assessment concluded that a wide degree of uncertainty would be created in regard to timber outputs, depending on how the rule was implemented and which of the advisory recovery actions were followed by the land management agencies. While the assessment did analyze different scenarios for timber production, it did not analyze a reserve-less strategy that could potentially allow for logging in currently protected forests older than 80 years, but not yet old enough to be considered high-quality owl habitat. At the same time, the environmental assessment appears to endorse a reserve-less strategy on page 94. A more complete environmental assessment is needed for the public to be able to fully assess the potential consequences of this rule. The economic analysis is also faulty and offers an incomplete look at the economic effects of the rule. In the plan's discussion on eliminating reserves, it offers both points of view in an incomplete discussion that did not cite studies showing the plan is working or that maintaining the system of reserves is necessary to conserve the owl. Several other references in the text suggest critical habitat should not be a reserve or hands-off area. This amounts to guidance to land managers to eliminate the reserves and only conserve high-quality owl habitat. We respectfully urge the service to make abundantly clear to the public and to the land managing agencies that elimination of the Northwest Forest Plan reserves is not an application of or a recommendation of the final rule, economic analysis, or environmental assessment. The draft rule fails to adequately protect critical habitat from adverse modification and encourages unproven thinning and forestry techniques in owl habitat and does not reflect the best available science. Under the draft rule, the only lands that are protected from adverse modification are high-quality owl habitat, but that is only generally and to the extent necessary, which suggests that even high-quality owl habitat could be logged under certain circumstances. The draft rule further states that if projects have considered ecological forestry principles, that in general these activities would not be considered adverse modification of owl habitat by the service. As a result of this provision, the normal protections provided by critical habitat to prevent adverse modification may not apply. ABC is opposed to the draft rule's encouragement of active management, the changes it suggests to management plans and projects, and controversial logging projects in suitable owl habitat that have already been initiated and approved by the service. Timber sales are being okayed, such as the regeneration of moist forest to create early sterile habitat that fragment the forest and set back the recovery of large blocks of habitat. The draft rule proposes to continue this harmful policy and should be revised to favor reducing forest fragmentation by maintaining the system of late successional reserves to allow the continued formation of large blocks of suitable habitat. The 1993 report of the Scientific Analysis Team reviewed the risks associated with logging in suitable owl habitat and concluded intentions to selectively cut forest stands to create conditions favorable for spotted owls represents increased risks to the viability of the spotted owl. The issue of short-term losses versus long-term habitat gains was also analyzed, and the scientists concluded that the short-term effect of these actions on habitat loss may be much more significant than the long-term predicted habitat gains. The Northwest Forest Plan was a significant environmental achievement that resolved this debate and should be built upon and extended by the Obama administration. This would be the best policy from a forest and wildlife management perspective and would also continue to provide legal certainty and an adequate regulatory mechanism to conserve and recover wide-ranging listed species. Forest Service reviews of the Northwest Forest Plan have found that the plan's conservation strategy and reserve networks are working as designed to protect habitat and restore degraded watersheds. The draft critical habitat rule notes that the Northwest Forest Plan has been successful in the conservation and recruitment of late successional forest and associated species, but then recommends to dismantle it based on two justifications: that commercial timber harvest from matrix lands has been insufficient, and the lack of active restoration in areas that may contain high risk of severe fire, or moist forests where early sterile habitats are lacking. A close look reveals that none of these reasons are justified. A look at timber output in the Northwest Forest Plan region shows that the agencies are at a sustainable level and meeting the volume budgeted by Congress. From 2003 to 2010, the agencies have offered 4.5 billion board feet, or 96% of the budgeted amount. In addition, exports from private forests are skyrocketing. In 2010, over 2 billion board feet of logs and lumber were exported from the West Coast. In 2011, it topped 3 billion board feet. There is no shortage of logging in the Pacific Northwest. I'd now like to introduce some information produced by Ernie Mimi, who reviewed the economic analysis that accompanied the draft rule. Under the ESA, an economic review is required for all critical habitat designations, and it can provide a basis for exclusions. However, in this case, the economic analysis that was produced was insufficient. It quantified only timber industry effects, it ignored the effects on the forest's ability to provide other goods and services, and it looks at the benefits of logging and ignores the costs. The environmental analysis also failed the requirements of Executive Order 12866 and OMB Circular A4. These basically require that the best economic information be put forward, and in this case, a great deal of information was simply not considered, and a lot of the potential risks and other information that apply to this were just simply not included. It also needs to be pointed out that logging does have costs, net cost often to the Treasury, but also reductions in other forest goods and services, reduced water quality, reduced recreational opportunity, lost opportunity to sequester carbon, and other aesthetic values such as aesthetics. We do not believe that logging is an economic solution. Exclusions in order to favor logging, we think, are not likely to end up having a lot of net benefits, and may end up having negative consequences by reducing growth in other industries that depend on intact forests. Again, here's a chart showing the amount of timber coming out in the Northwest Forest Plan area. Following some legal issues in the early 2000s, there's been a steady and sustainable amount of timber being produced, where the agencies have produced 96% of the amount of timber budgeted by Congress. In terms of recommendations, we think that the economic analysis needs to be broadened out and include information about the other values and the consequences of active management, and we do not believe the Secretary has adequate basis to exclude lands based on the information that was provided in that draft. The draft rule includes extensive language in support of active management, and this has raised concern from scientists. A number of scientists have proposed that an environmental impact statement is necessary in order to assess the effect of active management in owl habitat. While early seral habitats are desirable for some species, logging is not the best means to establish it in this region, due to the amount of natural disturbances that are available that can do the job for you. Simply refraining from post-fire logging has the potential to create abundant, high-quality, early successional habitats, and it is not acceptable to convert nesting, roosting, and foraging habitat of the northern spotted owl for this purpose. Studies by Hansen and Skinner have found that dry forests on the east side and in Northern California have not seen an increase in severe, high-intensity, catastrophic fires. Most of the acreage burned has been low to moderate severity with generally beneficial ecological effects. The risk of fire to owls also appears to be exaggerated in the final owl recovery plan and draft critical habitat rule, and the risk of loss of east side reserves has also been greatly overstated. The service is promoting an unacceptably risky strategy in the draft rule and in ESA consultations in regard to short-term losses of the owl. The draft rule leaves many important questions about the effects of active management unanswered. There's a lack of quantification of how many owls can be taken or habitat acres degraded. No thresholds are provided that land managers should not exceed, nor is there any indication how many additional owls may be gained by these projects, or how and where large blocks of habitat will be retained over time, absent the reserves. Given these uncertainties, a more cautious approach that maintains the reserves and their standards and guidelines is warranted. The service is recommending exemptions from critical habitat designation because the lands are already being conserved or that conservation purposes can better be achieved through exclusion. ABC opposes these exclusions and supports designating all of the identified acres, and we've also requested some additional acres be added in our comments. A legal review of the draft rule concluded that the rule proposes exemptions and active management in designated critical habitat not supported by the law or the best available science. It recommended that the service designate all lands, both federal and non-federal, identified as suitable habitat, and to adopt a much more cautious approach toward logging in designated critical habitat by eliminating or modifying language related to active management in the draft rule. The scale at which adverse modification of critical habitat will be assessed must be clarified to comply with the intent of the ESA. Other changes that are needed: active management in owl habitat should be considered experimental, conducted on a small scale, and monitored to determine its impact on northern spotted owls. The necessity and benefits of active management remain in dispute, and we therefore recommend the service lead the land management agencies in developing an environmental impact statement to devise a research strategy to get at these questions. The Northwest Forest Plan allows for management experiments in stands younger than 80 years. We recommend that these projects be limited to those areas. The plan also raises great concern for the marbled murrelet, which is likely to be adversely impacted by the proposed rule. The environmental assessment concluded that the proposed active management in owl critical habitat would likely be harmful to the threatened murrelet. We recommend that no experimental active management be allowed in marbled murrelet habitat. We're also concerned about the new planning process for the BLM managed lands in Oregon. Based on the administration's press statements, this proposal is likely to encourage regeneration in moist forest, which is harmful to the owl. The proposal to eliminate owl reserves on the Okanagan-Wenatchee National Forest has also raised great concern. This proposal also significantly weakens other standards and guidelines, such as road density standards, which would be detrimental to owl conservation. We're asking for the reserves to be maintained and for stronger restrictions against adverse modification in the final rule. The need for this is demonstrated by the large number of controversial timber sales that are already being proposed in owl habitat and being signed off on by the Fish and Wildlife Service under the same logic that it's okay to sacrifice owls in the short term in the hope of long-term habitat gains. This is now prompting legal challenges. The Beaver Slide project on the Six River National Forest proposes to remove and degrade owl habitat, some 850 acres of nesting and roosting habitat, and over 2,000 acres of foraging habitat. The goose timber sale in the Willamette National Forest would remove large mature trees from riparian buffers, adversely modify over 450 acres of suitable habitat, and the agency did not analyze or disclose impacts the logging will have on competition with barred owls. Our comment letter lists an additional dozen other controversial logging projects. The BLM has initiated a series of pilot projects to test the ideas of Norm Johnson and Jerry Franklin using regeneration harvest to produce early sterile forests. These pilots are raising concern on the moist projects because these are areas that are already providing owl habitat that should be retained. Local conservation groups are encouraging the BLM to discontinue this type of harvest, especially in the new proposed resource management plans. Other steps that can be taken, the owl, here's the page for the Secretary of Pilots, and other conservation measures that can be taken are to downgrade the owl status to endangered, increase the amount of monitoring, find out how many owls we have out there and how they're being affected by conservation efforts and active management. And for the benefit of future generations of Americans, and as part of our contribution to solving global climate change, the United States should permanently protect the Northwest mature and old-growth forests. Thank you very much for joining us today. Additional information is available on our website, and you can also contact me at sholmer@abcbirds.org. Thanks so much for joining us today. This is Steve Holmer with American Bird Conservancy.